Today's episode is all about advocacy. I posted a photo on my Instagram when I was at the State House a couple of weeks ago, and a bunch of people reached out to me and requested an episode on how to get involved in cannabis politics and reform in your area. So I reached out to a friend and someone I respect deeply in this space, Karen O'Keefe at MPP, the Marijuana Policy Project, and she agreed to come on the podcast. So hopefully this episode can be a resource if you're somebody who wants to get involved but doesn't necessarily know where to start. If you want to ask guests questions ahead of time, request topics, message me, and receive exclusive content, join the Bioactive Patreon for as little as $1 a month. If you want a free and easy way to support this podcast, please take 5 seconds and drop a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. It is much appreciated. If you listen to this podcast, you probably know by now I barely edit or cut anything out of these episodes. However, when Karen and I were discussing the current legal landscape here in New Hampshire, I did cut out a portion of this because recent advances make some of the conversations no longer relevant, and we want to make sure our previous opinions are not used in any way or confused with the amended bills which are currently being discussed. Lastly, shout out to everyone who has donated their time to cannabis reform. As Karen mentions, there are so many people who have been working on advocating for this plant for decades, and you do not go unnoticed. I understand there's a massive time and money loss from attending these meetings and hearings, so thank you for representing our community. I used to hate politics more than pretty much anything, and I still do, but I also understand that your voice does matter, especially at the local level. Nobody should be in jail for cannabis, and everybody should have access to cultivating this amazing plant. This episode came about because I was talking about some of the work I was doing in New Hampshire, and so many people were asking like resources or can you do an episode on this, because a lot of people want to get involved but don't really know the path forward to get involved or like how to get involved. So that's why I'm so stoked to have you on the podcast. So welcome, Karen O'Keefe, to the podcast. I want to hear more about what MPP does in general, but you're someone that I definitely look up to in the advocacy world, and I think that you can really help people kind of feel a little less intimidated by the process of advocating for yourself and for the industry and for this medicine. So if you want to just give a little bit of background, and then we'll kind of get into some of the misconceptions, some of the process, and go from there.
Sure. I'm Karen O'Keefe. I'm an attorney, but I don't do litigation. I just do the policy work at the Marijuana Policy Project. And in my spare time, I do a ton of advocacy related to other issues as well. When I was in law school, I had some cases as a student attorney that involved cannabis, and I saw in Louisiana just how staggering the racial disparities were in enforcement and how horrifically harsh some of the penalties were for cannabis possession.
You were in Louisiana at that time? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah,
Wow.
from 2003, I was in New Orleans, and at that time, if you had multiple convictions, past drug convictions and got a possession with intent, for example, or just possession conviction for marijuana, you could get 15 to 20 years in prison. So people lost, their entire children's childhood to being locked up over a small amount of cannabis. In the last few years, there was a case, Bernard Noble, who had been post-Katrina. He was riding his bike around with a joint. He had prior convictions, and I want to say he got sentenced to 13 years just for a tiny amount of marijuana. And since then, a ton of progress has been made. My colleague, Kevin Caldwell, worked with a bunch of advocates who are just doing it in their spare time. And I was actually surprised at what they were able to get done in New Orleans. They got decriminalization passed at the city level first. And in a lot of cases, when you see local decrim, the cops ignore it and keep arresting under state law. But that didn't happen. The first year, I want to say, after decriminalization, there was something like 16 total marijuana possession arrests for anything. So that's huge numbers of people that previously would have their lives completely ruined that weren't. And since then, Kevin and other allies pushed it to the state legislative level. And, this is a Republican controlled legislature at the time. And they passed decrim. It's not as broad as we'd like it, but it's, a civil offense. It's a fine for possession of up to 14 grams. And that's something that people literally lost a decade or more of their life to previously.
Oh man! So what point did you get involved with MPP? I know MPP's been around for a while. I think I read 1995 was when MPP first started. So when did you get involved there? And I know MPP's done some amazing things, but can you kind of just talk about that organization in general and like what the goals are and all that
Sure.
fun stuff?
So post law school, I moved to Washington, D.C. I was doing a lot of protesting the Iraq War, and it seemed like a place to go get barred and get involved in issues, including that. And I had never heard of MPP, but I cared about marijuana policy, and they were hiring. So I got hired back in 2003 as a legislative analyst that did state level work. At the time, there was something like 25% popular support for legalization, no legal states, a few decrim states that had passed in the 70s, and a total of 8 medical states. And I've been working there since then and now direct the state legislative department. MPP, basically, our motto is we change laws. And we take wins where we can get them. We try very hard and fight very hard to make laws as strong as they can be. But we do work on getting achievable progress. So, medical marijuana decriminalization, expanding those laws, expungement, release, wiping out criminal records, and legalization. And in those, we're a small, scrappy team, unfortunately, but we have a ton of resources on our site. There's a handful of states that we spend the vast majority of our time on, the ones that are the ripest for legalization, and then we also assist and help foster further reform in the other states, such as right now we're working on employment protection bill in Maryland and assisting with that. Language so that people don't get revoked on parole and probation for testing positive to cannabis after legalization. So there's a ton of ways to just keep moving the ball forward wherever a state is.
I love that you said a small and scrappy team because honestly, I think that's all of the best teams. They're just really passionate people doing things for the right reason, and that's definitely the vibe that I'm getting. And I'm so glad you're part of that. Do the actual states or do like advocates in the state reach out to MPP and say, "Yo, New Hampshire is struggling right now. Like, can we get some resources over here?" And then you kind of come and help, or what's that process like?
Yeah, so in some states it's like that. In some states, we're part of coalitions that, in some cases we spearhead and convene and put together. Both often there's, a handful of individuals and folks from other organizations that work together to get it done, and then the grassroots cadre that sign up to our email alerts or on social media or just find out about the issues from the news and show up and add their voice, and that's such an important part of it. State legislatures are pretty small. In New Hampshire, I think legislators get paid $100 or $500 a year, depending which chamber they're in. There's 400 of them in the House. So you can have a real impact at the state level. There are not that many people that show up to state legislators' coffee hours. So if you get on their list and show up and are polite and respectful and, dress conservatively enough and bring up issues.
Yeah, I want to talk about that more. I put my first vlog out into the universe, and it was actually vlogging the process of like going to the state house because I thought this was kind of a huge barrier for people is like that initial kind of what do I do? And I talked about a lot of things you just mentioned, like what you dress, like conservatively, how you prepare, like all this different stuff. And I posted and somebody said like, dang, Riley, like, do you have a bunch of tattoos? Because you're always dressed, like, your arms are always covered. And I'm like, I just dress like hyper professional when I'm going to the state house just because in my head, like, I'm representing cannabis consumers, I'm representing the cannabis industry. And, like, if I can just put on a suit coat just for a few hours and represent and have a good first impression, like that's super powerful. That's, you don't want your clothes to represent everything, but they're pretty impactful for first impression. And I also discussed in that video just how I like to script out everything I'm going to say before I actually go in there, because one time I tried not to do that and I felt like I did not hold myself well. So then the following time I came like with a printed version. I had it on my desktop in case, or my laptop in case I wanted to edit it. And that was just kind of my process. But I would love to kind of walk through what this process is like at a state house. Maybe there's a bill proposed, and maybe someone either wants to talk in support of that bill, or maybe they want to talk against that bill, and what that day might look like. Because I think together we can probably give a kind of good idea of what that's like and hopefully lower the barrier. And I also want to note that oftentimes these hearings take place at like 11 a.m. or 1 p.m. And a lot of people are working. Like if you can't go and give a verbal testimony because you're working, I think that makes a lot of sense. But there's other ways to contribute, like written testimonies and many other things. So I would love to kind of walk through that with you and just talk about what a day is like when you're talking in front of a state house or another important committee of sorts.
Yeah. So one thing to be aware of is it's different in every single state. So there are some states where hearings, they have selected witnesses that the sponsor and the opponents choose. And if you just show up to testify, you won't be able to if you're not on that list. So you want to find out beforehand what the process is in your state, how long you have to speak. In some states, they actually have a countdown where you have a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes. In some, there's no numerical limit, but it's kind of disrespectful to talk more than 3 to 5 minutes in most states because they have other bill hearings and other people are wanting to be heard too. So you want to find out first, what are the rules? Do you have to sign up online at first? In Maryland, I think you have to create an account online, then sign up online for the bill hearing. So you want to know all of that. Once you've figured out what the rules are, signed up if you need to, know what time to show up, definitely dress professionally. Remember, our goal is to get something done, not to have catharsis and feel good about ourselves. So this is the time to, I had a coworker that said, you go in camouflage to go to the state house. He was like a hunter. And you want to look the part. You want to defy expectations and remember that if it was all the people that just love cannabis and love legalization, you wouldn't need to be there because the law would have already passed. Your audience is the people that are kind of skeptical, and so craft your argument accordingly. I like the idea of writing out your statement. Some people are a little bit less fluid when they're reading, but if you go off the cuff, sometimes you can end up saying irrelevant things, not getting to say what you intended to say. You could write out the first couple sentences and do the bullet points you want to hit. I'd say if you've never done it before, you might want to practice a bunch of times just so it comes out more fluidly and so you know how long it is so you don't end up getting cut off at 2 minutes when you really had written 5 minutes of material.
Yeah, because that's stressful when they're like, okay, can you wrap it up? And you're like, I guess I'll stop talking now. It's just a little like embarrassing. That's happened to me.
And sometimes if other people have said the same thing as you can just, and should probably, if everything you plan to say somebody else has said, still go up and say it, but just say, to be respectful for the committee's time, I want to say that these people have made the points, maybe have one sentence to reiterate the key point, and then leave, and that will get you more points than if you repeat something that 4 people have said before you.
That's a good point. And you could reference it, be like, oh, I agree with what Daryl just said, but I wanted to add X, Y, Z. Oh, I will also note too, in New Hampshire, I don't know if this is with other states, you, especially in front of House committees, you have to fill out a little pink slip if you want to talk in front of the committee. And then you fill it out and say, okay, my name's Riley. I'm representing myself. I live in this county and I need 3 minutes to talk. And then you need to make sure you get that to the person who's in charge of that committee, or you can't talk. Because I did that the first time. I was just raising my hand and they're like, no, dude, that's not how this works.
Definitely. Yeah. And again, each state's different, but a lot of them that don't have online sign up do have that process where you go and sign up in person. And in some states, they'll let you check a box to say you want to express your support without actually speaking to, and then they'll list in the report how many people did that. So that's another option as well. And as you said, it can be, I think New Hampshire's a little bit better about having specific times for specific hearings. But for example, in Maryland, every hearing would be scheduled for noon, and then they wouldn't get to some till 8 p.m. because the committee has 10 different bills that they're hearing. So you might want to check online to watch a committee. before you go. So you just have a chance, or you could talk to, call the committee clerk and see if you can ask them some questions, or if there's a bill that's favorable that you're testifying for, you could try calling them. In some states, the legislators have no staff at all. It's just them, and they get paid almost nothing, so they don't have that much time to devote off the clock, because they have other jobs, because they have to earn a living. So it really depends on the state. But in some states, there's plenty of staff, and they can help you, walk you through it too. In addition to, as you said, if there's an advocacy group that's involved, they can also often help you figure out how to do it. But don't be intimidated. Everybody who's spoken in these committees had a first time, and a lot of the people that'll show up are in the same boat as you. And a lot of times the legislators are just very happy to have anybody show up. If you're bothering to go to the state house, you might want to stop by your own state house member and senator's office too, to let them know that you came there, and to tell them how you feel about the bill, and if there's any other cannabis policy issue that that you want to weigh in with. There aren't, again, that many constituents that bother to trek to the state house, so you really can get some good FaceTime and sometimes.
Oh, I totally agree with that. And I think that they do really appreciate, at least this is what I've noticed. I think people do appreciate, like, people in the cannabis industry, people with personal experience. I think personal stories are so important in these type of environments. A woman had, I'm not going to name drop her, I'll just say a woman had stood up in front of the House committee when we were talking about a home grow bill, which myself and many people are so passionate about home grow. And she had cancer in her arm, and her arm had to be amputated. And she told this amazing story about how cannabis has helped her remove the sensations of phantom limb syndrome. And I had never heard of that before. But, of course, that does make sense. It changes our mind-body connection, our sensitivity to so many different things. But, just seeing her up there telling her story, I think that tells that holds just as much power as citing a scientific paper or talking about, data-driven research in the industry. Like, those personal anecdotes are so important from a community standpoint, and I think they resonate the most with me. I love hearing them.
Definitely. And that's what, a lot of the medical cannabis bills that we first worked on 23 years ago, there was one or two patients that told their story. A lot of times the medical society was opposed, the police were opposed, and those people's story of, I'm suffering, this helped my family member before they died of cancer, this could help me, that's what passed the bill. It was just the human perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I will also say there's so many people in the cannabis industry that, even, this is not about like reform in any way, but we'd just be talking and they would just, really put in these insightful things into these conversations, and I write them down so that when I'm writing up what I'm going to say in front of these committees, it's something that kind of holds weight in multiple ways. And one of these examples is I was talking to one of our research partners, and he was talking about Kissack's triangle of healthcare, which is, the triangle consists of quality, access, and cost. And you can't change anything in a healthcare system without affecting more than one of these. Like, it's hard to have actually, it's never been accomplished that all three of these were improved at the same time. And I was talking about how home grow is actually one of the things that does improve quality, access, and cost of medicine at the same time. And I was just directly quoting what he was telling me in this previous meeting, but it was applicable to this proposed bill, because it really is. If we can allow medical patients, or even just people who consume cannabis, to cultivate their own medicine, they're going to have that connection with that product. Even just gardening and cultivation in general has so many meditative qualities. I am so passionate about home grow, access to home grow. I think it would solve a lot of issues in the cannabis industry, in our healthcare system, and in our country. And there was another thing that came up at the last meeting too, about New Hampshire currently has to cultivate all of their, I don't know how common this is, they have to cultivate all of their cannabis indoors, so they can't use any greenhouses and they can't have any outdoor cultivation for the medical program. So in a proposed bill, the ATCs were asking essentially if they could expand by using greenhouses. And then the committee was like, oh, we have no need for that. Like, there's no reason that you need greenhouses. People don't want to see weed, blah, 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 blah. They're going to smell it. And I was citing a paper that was published last year by Columbia University that showed that sun-grown cannabis produces unique chemistry, and indoor cultivated cannabis has a higher amount of degraded and oxidized cannabinoids and terpenes. So even greenhouse grown or even outdoor grown cannabis has significantly different bioactive compounds and medicinal potential compared to indoor cultivation. And there is medical rationale for why we should have these different flower types available to people. And the only reason I had that paper just floating in my head at that time is because somebody else, who's called Queen of the Sun Grown, we had just talked about it on her podcast and had this wonderful conversation. And again, I reached out to her after and I'm like, dude, thank you so much for like bringing up that paper, because it came in so handy talking to these legislators. And you're actually citing a paper. Like, this is not my opinion. I love outdoor flower. I love smoking outdoor flower. But this is not my opinion. This is research from Columbia that holds so much weight when you're talking in these types of environments where they want to see that data-driven research. It was just a really, really cool experience.
That's so great. I'll have to check out that paper too. I hadn't seen it. We have a whole document on home cultivation, and I'll have to add that in too.
I'll send it to you for sure. It's one of my favorite papers that was released last year. Is there anything else we want to say as far as the day of? I'm trying to like walk through this in my head and think if there's anything else that would be helpful.
Yeah. One thing to know is that in some states, legislators will ask witnesses questions. It's pretty rare, especially if you're just there to tell your personal story. So don't get too worried about it. It's very, very rare unless you're somebody that has all the background in science, like you do, Riley, or, a policy wonk. It's okay, and you should, in fact, if you don't know the answer, just say a different witness would be better to ask, or if you want, you could say, I can follow up with you on that, and you could email me and see if I have some information, and look on our website. We have a ridiculous amount of background information on lots of different policies, but just know there are sometimes questions that are asked, and also know some states have votes the same day as the hearing. There'll be a hearing, and then they vote on the bill. And in some states like New Hampshire, there's a separate, what they call work session, where they come back and they vote on the bill then. So just know you won't always have, know how it went at the end of the day.
That's a great point. Yes. And I think one other thing I would add is just arrive early to anything you're going to, especially at the State House, because it's really confusing. Like, there's, at least here, like there's a variety of different buildings that this may take place in. Everything's an acronym. Everything has, 5 different floors and so many different things going on. So I like to show up early. But I also wanted to mention, even before that point, like if you decided that I want to get involved in New Hampshire, I want to get involved in Maine, I want to get involved in West Virginia, whatever it is, how to even align with maybe like-minded people before you get to the point of the State House. So like if you can find these different coalition groups, or you can find these different advocate groups, what do you think are some good ways to kind of identify where those groups are and how to communicate with them and potentially get involved?
Yeah, so it depends on the state. I mean, I guess you could Google the state name cannabis organization and see what comes up in a lot of states. Normal has chapters in a lot of states as well. And, if you just show up at some hearings on the bill, you can see who else is there working on it. If you just want to find out what's happening, we have what we call an overview page for each state. So you can go to MPP/state/the state's name, and we'll kind of have a snapshot of what's going on with legalization. At the bottom, we have a list of all the bills that are pending. In some cases, that page will mention what organizations are involved. And, if you look at news articles that are about cannabis policy reforms that are happening, you can see probably an organization's name that's quoted and reach out to them. If there's a bill that's sponsored, you could potentially reach out to the sponsor's office and ask what organizations are working on the bill, and then see if you can plug in and connect with them.
Okay, cool. I think that's great advice. That's exactly what I did. I think I just Googled like New Hampshire cannabis, and then I found somebody who was a representative in my region, and I reached out to him, and then we met up for coffee, and then he linked me with the rest of the crew. And I ended up being actually now I'm a New Hampshire Cannabis Advisory Board member, which is super cool. I hope we're going to see a lot of change in this state. I think we're on the cusp of it, and hopefully it will be for all the right reasons and have nothing to do with presidential elections or other elections. Can we also just emphasize written versus verbal testimonies? We kind of just described the process of a verbal testimony. If you had a proposed bill, a proposed subject, you would go and talk in front of a committee. But you can also submit a written testimony, specifically if you're not able to make that meeting because your schedule just doesn't allow it, or you might have accessibility, mobility issues, and you're not able to get to a place like that. So remotely, what are some ways that people can voice their opinion, voice their support or opposition for something just online?
So the easiest way to do it is just send an email to your state legislators, and we have form emails for almost every state. If you go to that same page, mpp.org/state/your state name, in most cases there's an email that you can find there on whatever bill's pending that you can write. You can change the wording of it. Of course, your own state legislator is going to care more about what you think than ones that you're not in the district of. Normal also has a Take Action site that's got lots of different links to mobilizing on different things. Then you don't have to write anything from scratch. It's very, very, very easy. One step up from that is to do written testimony on a bill. And again, you'll really want to check to make sure what the rules are. In some states, it has to be in a couple days in advance. I think there are states where you still have to print out like a dozen copies. You'll want to make sure what you know the rules before you do it. Usually you'll start it with Dear Chair, the chair's name, vice chair, their name, and honorable or distinguished members of the committee. Then you write your testimony and sign it. Sometimes there are rules about what it says at the top of it. Usually you want the bill number, whether you're opposed or supportive. And, don't be too intimidated. You can keep it very short and simple, and then you will still be in the record if it's too intimidating to write a long, lengthy piece of testimony. As you mentioned, people's personal story is very, very impactful in a lot of ways. So, if it's employment discrimination and you lost a job or didn't apply for a job because of drug testing and cannabis helps you, you can explain that. Whatever the case is, if you have a personal connection, explain that. A lot of lawmakers don't have that much education about cannabis and have a lot of, there have been decades of reefer madness and we're breaking through it a lot, but a lot of that is still there, especially with legislators that tend to be a lot older and from the generation where they only think of people as not being productive if they're cannabis consumers. So just spell out your story, spell out if that's what you want to share. You can find some arguments for a lot of different issues on our website, and just get your voice out there.
I think that's great advice. I remember during my last testimony, I mentioned I'm a daily cannabis user because I always like to say that because I looked very professional and I introduced myself as a PhD scientist. So I like to just allow people to see the different faces of daily cannabis consumers. And somebody on the committee asked me why I use cannabis every day. And it was just a really funny interaction because the chair was like trying to make him stop talking. And I'm fine with talking about it, but it was just like this weird tiff. It was funny. But anyway, from someone in your position and your point of view, and people, you've worked with so many different states and so many different types of people, what do you think is a main barrier, or how can we get more people involved, or, what do you suggest for people? How do we get people kind of mobilized into making these really important, advances towards their local politics for cannabis? I don't know if I'm asking that in the right way, but you've worked with so many people. What's the best way to really facilitate change?
Well, I'm really glad that you're doing this and just getting the word out to more people and getting more people plugged in, engaged, understanding how the process works, and that their voice really, really, really can make a difference and does. We can send out emails, share on social media. Unfortunately, a lot of social media platforms have kind of shadow bans and other things that make it harder to get as large of an audience as we should have. Certainly, if you make donations to MPP, we can use the money and we can do things like paid advertising and text banking and phone banking when we need to, when there's a bill that's moving and we need to make sure that people that care about it find out about it. But spread the word on your social media, talk to people, get engaged. And it's very in terms of showing up, it is tough. It's a huge time commitment in some cases. It can be a whole day that you wait around to speak for a minute. You have to miss a day of work. It takes, it can be intimidating to figure out the process in some cases. So that can all be barriers. I think some people just feel cynical. A lot of these reforms take years and years and years to get done. But eventually they get done, and then you have legalization forever after it. And I understand how frustrating it can be that it takes a while, but if you don't, and you can just speak 1 year, you don't have to commit to doing it forever. But know that sometimes these things, and almost always, these bills take a while to get passed. And just don't forget that it matters, and don't forget that your voice matters. That's the only reason we went from 0 legalization laws to 24 now, and from when I started MPP, 8 medical laws to 38. Every one of them, if it wasn't for people making their voices heard, speaking out, sharing their stories, none of those would have happened.
I would love to just talk through something with you because it's something that's currently bothering me on our state level, but I understand, even though it's bothering me to this degree, maybe it would increase access to cannabis enough that it would still be a positive, but I'm kind of trying to work out my feelings on it. And it's the franchise model of cannabis dispensaries in New Hampshire. I have been against this since day one because I think it takes out the culture, it takes out the trust. And I guess my question would be like, what level are we willing to compromise in order to increase access? Like, it's such a balancing act. This is the part where I cut out a large portion of the conversation, but I'll attach some recent news articles about the current status of adult use market in New Hampshire, just for some relevant updates.
Yeah, and I think both of the bills have language so that all the retailers post legalization would have to stock lower potency THC too. So it doesn't ban higher potency. I think there's educational materials worked into it so that consumers would have an honest, scientifically accurate information about risks, harm reduction, and then they can make their own decisions as grown-ups.
Yeah. And speaking of education, so that is a big part of this proposed bill, is implementing education in dispensaries, on social media and traditional media, all these different outlets. How do we go about educating legislators? Is there an avenue for this? Is there any sort of program that is developed to kind of help them in a scientific, unbiased way learn a little bit about cannabis? Or is that really up to them on their own to learn that and try to, find the right resources?
So certainly people like you showing up at hearings is key to that because you get to be right there and have a captive audience educating them. But 5 minutes every year or so might not be as much as, they might need a little bit more. And it's not the entire legislature, just one committee. The National Conference of State Legislatures has meetings every year and has periodic ones in the off session that a lot of lawmakers go to. They've had a number of panels on cannabis, although not really focused on the science of cannabis. The National Academies of Sciences have recently had multiple panels on various aspects related to cannabis. I haven't gotten to dive into them very much, but they just had one on social equity. So there are some things being done. Certainly you could just send a YouTube video to your legislator that talks through the science things and hope that they listen to it. You could put together town halls potentially and ask lawmakers to it. But unfortunately, there is, as I mentioned, most of them are paid very little for their work as lawmakers, and many of them have other jobs too, and they have so many bills every year that they're considering. So it's a problem. There isn't as much education as there should be, and it's all the more important that voices show up and make themselves heard for the issue.
Yeah. And great point, just that they are spread really, really thin, and they're already reading so many documents like every single night. And yeah, trying to make that education easy, I think, is huge, like a YouTube video. They probably would prefer that over a massive document that you just email over and you're like, read all this literature on cannabis and driving. Instead, you can be like, hey, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about the science behind cannabis and driving. So yeah. I think that's great advice. And, I think the legislators would appreciate that too.
Yeah, I've heard just do a one-pager if you're sending it to lawmakers. If you're sending them information, no, they probably won't have the time. With rare exceptions. Some read everything you send them, but they have a lot coming out.
Yeah.
There's 400 members of the House of New Hampshire, and every single bill gets a floor vote. So each of those bills, think of how much information is submitted on.
I have thought about this a lot because even like, before I show up, this is another thing I do that I discussed in that YouTube video vlog thing I put out is definitely read the bill. Make sure that you're educated on what is being talked about there so that everyone sounds as good as possible in front of everyone. So a question I had is because you've worked with so many different states and so many different people, what state do you think has, quote, done it right, in your opinion, when passing legislation for cannabis? I know every state is kind of doing their own thing, but is there any one state that kind of sticks out to you? Like, man, they really nailed it. Like, they really hit all those important things.
Every state, I have something that I wish they'd done better. Rhode Island has a lot of good stuff, but there's also some complaints because they have really high fees. Connecticut looked on paper like they'd done a really good job, and then they offered way too few licenses. New York looked really good for equity, but in practice, there was a very slow rollout. So unfortunately, I'm having trouble finding somebody that across the board did it great.
No, those are good examples, though. And just in general, I guess I'm kind of back to the New Hampshire thing. It's probably best to just pass a law that's good enough for what you're looking for because you can always amend it later. But the hardest part is like that initial push into a adult use market. Is that right? Like once you actually have any sort of push, and then it's like, okay, later you figure out this isn't working out. Let's change this. Let's delete this portion. Let's add an amendment here. Go from there.
No state has repealed legalization. No state has repealed medical marijuana. One of the first medical cannabis bills that MPP was working on when I got hired was Vermont, and it was so difficult to get it passed. And all that could get through had AIDS, MS, and cancer as the only three qualifying conditions. You could grow one plant, and that was the one mature plant, I think, and that was the only means of access.
One plant?
Yeah. So throughout the years, I kept pushing for more, added pain, added all these other conditions, added dispensaries, added more plants. So it's so much easier to improve upon something than it is to start from nothing and get legalization done. So to me, you want to push for having the bill to be as strong as possible, but I'd say as strong as possible without being something the governor would veto, because it's just not going to become law then. The Senate has never passed legalization. Last year it was a 10-14 vote. So, there's some Republican senators that are not big fans of legalization, whose votes are also needed. However, you also need to hold all the Democrats who are going to push for some good, strong hopefully for some good, strong provisions for non-discrimination and things like that. So I'd say, as long as it's better than the status quo, try to get the strongest thing that can pass. But if it can't pass, it's a piece of paper. It's not going to help anybody.
Yeah. Speaking of just some of the Republican leaders, and this is never, I'm never going to bash an entire party. Like I love a lot of people, but this was just funny because I was walking down the streets of Manchester, New Hampshire, with another member of NHCAN advisory board, and we're walking around, and he's very well connected to like the political landscape in New Hampshire. And we passed one of the people who's a Republican leader who has voted many times against cannabis. And he was telling me his personal story of why he hates weed. And I was like, I'm wearing a shirt that says, what did my shirt say? Ask me about weed. Something like absolutely massive on the front. I'm clearly a pro-cannabis person. And we were like interviewing people on the street. And he told me that he will never support cannabis because one of his childhood friends used cannabis when he was younger, and he later died of liver cancer, and he thinks it was because of the cannabis, and now he will never support it for the rest of his life. And I was like, oh my God, this is what we're dealing with? Like, this is why this has been so difficult. Is like, obviously I talked about the importance of personal stories before, but like personal stories that are true, like personal stories that, I mean, obviously that's true in his head, but that's so sad to me that like there's obviously not a correlation there, like a connection. And in his head, he is just 100% convinced that that person died from cannabis and that it's, the worst substance in the world. And that was just a little bit of an eye opener for me. I think I needed that as a perspective shift, because in my head I'm like, why on earth don't people like cannabis? It must be from the propaganda back, in the 60s. But you have stories like this too that definitely contribute, and everyone has their own perspective that's been shaped from so many experiences in their life, and you just don't know until you start talking to people. And I'm sure if I could sit down with them for 3 hours, we might actually get somewhere together, but you just don't have that time and resource with like every single person who's important on these committees.
Luckily, we probably won't need his vote though. But in general, it is worth noting how many people have changed their mind in cannabis, though. It's more than double the support that there was 20 years ago. And that's both there being younger people that are getting voting age and also people just changing their opinion. So even people who think cannabis is really this terrible thing, like the governor came around, the governor of New Hampshire, Sununu, and came to say, well, I think it's really bad, but I think it's more of a harm reduction to have regulated access, because he was afraid of cannabis being laced with fentanyl, which if that has ever happened, it's very rare, but there definitely are things that are in illicit cannabis in some cases that are way more dangerous than if it's safe and lab tested and grown under regulated circumstances, whether that's hazardous heavy metals or pesticides, or I definitely know people that have had cannabis that was laced with other drugs that they would not have voluntarily used, like PCP and cocaine back 20 years ago or so. So there are ways you can get to people, even who have this idea that it is the devil's lettuce.
Yeah, and we have so much evidence as a harm reduction tool, right? Whether it's reducing the amount of alcohol, the amount of pharmaceutical drugs, the amount of so many different things, especially with the opioid epidemic here, and in so many different states in the United States. I think anything that can show such powerful evidence as a harm reduction tool, I mean, you got to pay attention to that. You got to at least give it a chance. And now we're looking at cannabis as a way to facilitate exercise. Like, there's so many benefits to cannabis, but I guess step one is just finding the ability to listen to that data and to kind of put back in your head anything that you might have been taught earlier that might not have a lot of truth or data to it.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's really important is that we be accurate and truthful as much as we can be too. A lot of the opponents do not have the facts on their side. They will claim that teen use increased after legalization when it didn't. They'll make all kinds of claims about traffic safety that are not actually borne out by the evidence. And it's really important as an advocate that lawmakers can trust you and know that what you're saying is true. So if you don't know the answer to something, don't make it up. We have tons of data on our website. There's lots of other resources with accurate information. But we do really want to make sure that we know what we're saying and don't overstate things.
Great point. I used your website when I was writing my testimony for cannabis and driving. It's a fantastic resource. You should definitely check it out. And I also upload all of my testimonies on my website if anybody wants to just, use those for whatever you're presenting, or if you just want to read them for, whatever reason. It's up to you, but they're available if you want to. But is there anything we haven't covered yet that you think is very important for our community to know when it comes to advocating for cannabis and speaking about it and getting involved in local or state politics?
I'd say you want to check at what your starting point is on your state when you get involved. Probably, check on our website. If you don't have medical or decrim, you can still do organizing if you want to on legalization, but there's no state that has ever passed legalization before those two things. And if there's an active bill that looks like it has a chance on decrim and medical, that might be where you want to focus your efforts, because especially if there's a state legislative process and not a ballot initiative process. Only about half the states in the country have a ballot initiative process, the other half are legislative. So you want to kind of know your starting point. But if there is an issue that you're dealing with that you think a law could remedy, like you lost your job over cannabis, there's no employment protections for medical or adult use, and you have either whatever the law is, the medical or adult use, consider just asking for a meeting with your state legislator, laying it out, and see if they're willing to put in a bill. Because that's a lot of the ways that things start, is just people have a story from somebody in their district, and they put in a bill to fix it. So that's something that can have a tremendous amount of impact. And then you can kind of think of who are the most likely allies for this if you're starting from scratch in a state. And you can look for our website to see how many other states, states' employment protections have employment protections, some arguments for it, how the language is often drafted. We have that as part of our model bill. And then, you could reach out maybe to the unions in your state, especially if it's a pro-union state, to see if they'd endorse it, if there's any cannabis organizations. It's really, really helpful to not just have cannabis policy and organizations on board, and to also see if there's any other allies that might have some political clout that are willing to step up and support it. And no, they've got a ton of other priorities too, so it won't be their number one thing, but just being able to say they're supportive or have written testimony by them can really help add some oomph to that effort.
Totally. I love that. The ingrained racism against cannabis is still very, very abundant during these hearings. I'm sure you've noticed this. I definitely did. I mean, there was people standing up talking about how the current illicit market is because of these Chinese mafia, running blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, whoa, I feel like we shouldn't be talking like that when we have nothing to back this up. And it happened multiple times. And I actually brought up in my testimony, I said something about racism. And I'm like, as we clearly see in this room today, this continues. It's like, and again, it's like that is their experience. I understand that's their lived experience, but we got to move on from that. It's still so highly ingrained, and it's affecting so many populations still that this is kind of what we're dealing with at a legislative level, but also boots on the ground too, whether it's a legal market, illicit market, racism is rampant, and it's kind of what started this war on cannabis to begin with, and it's still happening to this day. And it's just sad to see how apparent that is. But of course, there's always, at least in New Hampshire, there's always more people talking about pro-legalization versus the people talking anti. So that's really encouraging. And the people who are talking, trying to get these bills passed, they're usually very well educated. They are citing facts. They are citing literature. And it really does make our community look awesome. And I love seeing that in front of everyone. And the committee sees it too. People who are watching it on YouTube, they see it too. They're commenting. And it just is very uplifting that, of course, yeah, there's still people speaking in that rhetoric, but there's far more people on an educated and personal story, lived experience perspective talking about all the positives. And I think that's why it's so important to show up, just so that we have these numbers and we can make our community look so good and so well educated and so well represented. And it makes the other people look like they have no idea what they're talking about, because they don't.
And if you have a good relationship with a committee member and an opponent is spewing a bunch of nonsense, then sometimes you can get them called on it. One great example was in Maryland. I think it was the police chief for Annapolis, where the capital is, testified that there were, 32 people that he claimed had fatally overdosed on marijuana on the day that they legalized in Colorado. And it was like The Onion. It was a satirical website. And
oh my God.
The sponsor, who might have also found out on his own. And as the police chief was testifying, he was able to mention that it was a satire site. That's what the opponents were resorting to as they testified, and it made the news and was pretty wonderful.
That is so funny. I love The Onion, and I've also been fooled by a few of their articles thinking that they were not satire. That is amazing. Thanks for sharing that. As we get towards the end of this, I wanted to ask your opinion on Schedule 3 in the United States and how MPP, how you feel about this, how it affects our industry, if you're comfortable talking about it. If not, feel free not to, but I'm just curious what your perspective is like from a lawyer, an advocate perspective.
So I believe, but I'm not quite 100% certain, that it will be an improvement, but not a dramatic improvement. So we as MPP are supportive of rescheduling to Schedule 3. Currently, marijuana is Schedule 1, meaning it has no medical value and a high potential for abuse. That's obviously nonsense. That is just not true. Schedule 3 is for drugs that have medical value and have a low to moderate potential for abuse, which is accurate. The practical implications of rescheduling are another question. So symbolically, finally, the federal government would be admitting again, which it hasn't done in decades, that cannabis has medical value and doesn't have a huge potential for abuse. none of the businesses that exist now would suddenly be legal under federal law. Everything that's operating isn't consistent with all the rules for Schedule 3 substances. They have to be grown in DEA approved facilities, I believe. You have to be dispensed from like pharmacies, not standalone stores. So it's not like it would make everything legal. It would improve the tax burden because right now every cannabis business can't deduct business taxes. So that drives up prices for patients and consumers and makes it less competitive with illegal cannabis. So that's one practical benefit. There could be other benefits too. Most of them are probably somewhat indirect, but you have some states that have an automatic trigger where you reschedule at the state level. In some states, it's illegal to drive, I believe, with any amount of a Schedule 1 substance in your body. There's also some states where people have gotten fired for using cannabis. Their state has a lawful off-duty activity statute that would protect them, but for cannabis being federally illegal. So in those cases, you might see some other practical impacts. I know there have been some concerns that you might also see a federal crackdown on the state legal businesses if you have Schedule 3. I don't see any reason that would happen. I mean, they're all illegal as Schedule 1. They're no more or less illegal than they would be under Schedule 3. And any idea that you would have a ton more FDA-approved products, from what I heard, it took, I want to say $1 billion in 10 years for Epidiolex to be approved. So it's a really slow, costly process for each individual drug. So, you need continued advocacy to push to make sure that it continue to have the hands-off perspective. But from my perspective, it's progress. It's certainly like a pathetically small step forward, right? Cannabis should be federally legal. It should at least be decriminalized. It's nonsensical that it's this small of a step, but if you can get this small of a step or nothing, you go for the tiny step, I say.
Yeah, and that was kind of my question too, like similar to how we're talking about just like getting a bill passed just to get a bill passed and then it can be amended later. I think this is a step towards descheduling, at least I hope so. But of course, it's going to cost the industry so much money, and just like understanding this implications, whether it's like direct or whether it's like hiring a good legal team to understand what these implications mean. It's just going to be very, very expensive for a lot of people. But I agree. I think it is overall a positive, but it is also kind of a slap in the face if you're looking at the data for cannabis, compared to some of these other substances.
Yeah, I will note that HHS and DEA they probably don't have the authority to go further than that. So anything else would have to be through Congress. So it's not like the DEA, just because you've just chosen to deschedule, they have the authority to reschedule, but not deschedule. There's some legal debate about that, but it's more likely than not that that's all it could do.
I didn't know that. Thanks. Yeah, that's important. Yeah, I think we'll hear a lot of these conversations happening. I think, it's funny that it's such a banger, headline saying cannabis has medicinal properties according to the DEA. And it's like, wow, give those scientists a raise. Did they read for the first time? Like, that's amazing. But we'll take it, I guess.
And I mean, I've lobbied in South Carolina where they don't have medical cannabis, and the opponents are still saying it's a Schedule 1 substance, it's federally illegal. So at least they'll have to change that argument slightly. Yeah. I don't know if they'll convert those folks, but it takes one argument away.
Exactly. And yeah, a win is a win. So we'll take it. You mentioned MPP website and newsletter. Is there any other great ways to be in contact with you or MPP or any other organizations that you support that the listeners should follow?
Yeah, just connect with MPP on our website, social media. I think it's on almost all of the social medias.
It is, for sure. But I appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk about your expertise. I appreciate everything you've done for our industry. You've made leaps and bounds in so many states and really changed a lot of lives. So thank you for all the advocacy work you do and representing our community. And thank you for being on the podcast and having this conversation. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I'm so impressed with you and with all you're doing to educate folks, including lawmakers. Thanks for having me on.
Mad love. Thanks for listening. Both of the YouTube videos I mentioned about the chemistry of outdoor sun-grown versus indoor cultivated cannabis, as well as the vlog at the State House, will be in the show notes of this episode and on my YouTube channel. See you next week.